intensitate și număr de scene, violență de limbaj minimă ca durată, nuditate fără conotații sexuale.
One of the most powerful men on earth holds a position that has existed for nearly 2,000 years. As the world changes and faith evolves, his authority remains. What began with one apostle has become 1.2 billion followers under one man. He is the head of the Catholic Church, the Pope. And this is his path to power. In this episode, never-before-seen artifacts from the earliest days of Christianity show how a small group of rebels turn an illegal movement into the largest religion on the planet, and how, against all odds, the papacy endures.
This is something that has never happened before. The Vatican this morning publicly displayed what's believed to be bone fragments from St. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ and the world's first pope.
Pope Francis is the 266th leader of the Catholic Church. For the last 2,000 years, despite an ever-changing world, Catholics have looked to the Pope as a beacon of faith, morality, and divine guidance. But who is this figure that means so much to so many? And how did he come to be one of the most powerful men on earth?
People look to the Pope to have something to say on almost everything.
He transcends the Catholic Church.
I don't think there's any other religious figure that people recognize as much as they recognize the Pope.
But before the Pope had the ear of 1.2 billion followers worldwide, he was a philosopher, a leader of an underground movement, and an outlaw.
Peter was one of the 12 apostles. He's walked with Jesus, essentially. So he's an important figure for that reason alone.
In the Gospels, when the apostles go fishing in Galilee, Peter is told, "You are Peter," which means rock. "And on this rock I will build my church, and I will give to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven."
And Jesus Christ said to Peter, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter said, "You're the Christ. You're the Son of God." So he became the authenticating voice.
Peter himself, as the one who voiced the confession, becomes a symbol of the unwavering faith that Jesus is the Son of God, which is then the center of the Christian church.
Though the word Pope is not used for hundreds of years, the foundation of the sacred office is entwined in Peter's legacy.
The popes are, if you like, the inheritors of the apostolic generation.
It's this idea of the papacy being the rock, a source of permanence in an age of anxiety that people know is steady.
Peter preaches that Jesus Christ died for the sins of man, and accepting that truth is the key to salvation. Others teach different variations of that message, but regardless of interpretation, in the first century, any follower of Christ is seen as a threat to the Roman Empire and hunted for his beliefs.
When you think about the beginning of the Christian movement, it's astonishing that this movement went anywhere. People are being arrested, they're being tortured, they're being killed in public. You see competition between different disciples, different versions of the message of Jesus.
All of Christ's followers spread throughout the Mediterranean, preaching his message. But the apostles are the men on earth who actually walked with Jesus himself.
There were all of these different cities that had healthy Christian churches in them. But the only one that actually had an apostle at its head was the church in Rome, which was where Peter was centered.
Rome is a giant empire. If you're a Christian, then you're saying that you believe in a man, Jesus, who is a king above all kings and not the Roman king. You are putting yourself in opposition to the Roman Empire. And that becomes a really dangerous situation for early Christians.
Despite the dangers facing Christians in Rome, Peter holds secret gatherings where he preaches the word of Christ.
Rome is a society which is 75 to 80% slaves. Slaves are not human. They can't marry. They can be bought and sold. They can be whipped and raped. So suddenly there's this movement that's saying, you're a person with dignity who's created in the image of God, and that makes you worthwhile. So that's part of the power of this Christian movement.
Christ's message strikes a chord with the most downtrodden members of Roman society, and Peter's meetings become more and more popular. Inevitably, he catches the eye of one of the cruelest and most sadistic rulers in Roman history, Emperor Nero. In the summer of 64 AD, a raging fire burns Rome for 6 days, destroying 2/3 of the city.
People say that Emperor Nero started the fire so he could advance his own building projects.
Some of Rome needed to catch on fire so that he could build the kinds of temples and things that he wanted to honor himself.
Rumors that Nero started the fire himself begin to fly, and he needs a scapegoat.
People are already asking a lot of questions about his sanity, his capacity to rule, and so on. He looks around for a bunch of people that other people don't like.
And the most convenient people to blame it on were the Christians.
Nero says, these are the people who are the problem. They're the ones who set the place on fire. Let's do terrible things to them.
Nero orders his soldiers to round up as many Christians as they can find.
Nero had them hung to poles and burned alive in his gardens.
He had some of them torn up by wild animals.
It isn't long before Peter is swept up in the raids. He is convicted of insurrection and sentenced to die on the cross.
He is crucified upside down, which is a really horrible way to die. He says that he does not want to die the same way that his Lord and Savior dies. He wants to die upside down because he's not worthy to die in the same way that Jesus died.
Peter's death is a devastating loss to the early Christian community. But dying in the name of his God makes him a martyr and secures his legacy as the first true leader of the church that will one day become the most powerful force on the planet. History names Peter the first pope. After Peter's violent death, Christians realized they must organize their movement if they have any hope of survival in the face of Roman tyranny.
They thought rather like the American revolutionaries, as one of them said, we all have to hang together or we shall surely all hang separately.
They created an agreement with a set of rules.
Deep within the private library of the Greek patriarch in Jerusalem lives the 2,000-year-old document that outlines the first cohesive guidelines of Christianity. It's called the Didache.
This document actually presents the formation of the church in its primitive stage.
This sacred text was lost until 1883, when a Greek translation from the 11th century was found. Out of fear of theft or desecration, it has never before been seen on camera until now.
You don't have a Bible back then. How do you transmit the faith? How do you tell them how to behave? How do you tell them what to do in a service? The DDK does all of that for you.
But outlining the rules is only the first step. Christians also need an infrastructure to enforce those behaviors.
We tend to think about Christianity as being all these basilicas around the world. But before that, what you had were basically house churches. And if you had a series of small house churches, you needed somebody to be over that.
Christians were trying to set up an organized community so that people would recognize who the members of that church were. A kind of hierarchy, sort of modeled on the Roman army.
Bishop of means the most senior churchman in that particular city.
Because Rome is the capital and the center of the empire, the Bishop of Rome becomes the leader of the other bishops, a position that will eventually become known as Pope. In the 200 years after Peter's crucifixion, bishops and their followers continue to be persecuted and executed by Roman emperors, until an unlikely hero emerges.
Constantine was a great military commander, and when it was his turn to become a junior emperor, he decided to fight his competition.
Constantine, the pagan commander of Rome's Western army, declares war on the commander of the East to decide who will be sole emperor of Rome. And the day before the battle, he has a startling vision.
He looks up and he sees the sign of the cross.
And he thought it was a promise from Jesus that he would win the battle.
Constantine does win the battle, and the new emperor is forever changed by his vision.
He decides he's going to be a Christian.
One of his first official acts as the first Christian emperor of Rome is to issue the Edict of Milan. This not only makes Christianity legal, but favored.
This is the big one. For the first time, a Roman emperor decided to ally with the church. That meant the whole of the known world was at the disposal of the church.
As Constantine moves Christianity from outlawed to exalted, church and state become intertwined.
Constantine saw in Christianity a way of uniting the empire, a new ideology that would give everybody the same God, the same moral values.
Constantine, by legalizing Christianity, opened up a space where the Bishop of Rome could become a permanent fixture on both the spiritual and the political scene.
What Constantine did is take the bishops who had been previously persecuted and make them his agents. He treated them like members of his administration. So now he would take the Bishop of Egypt, the Bishop of Jerusalem, the Bishop of Athens, and state power would go through them.
Bishops become important people in the local community. If people have disputes with each other, they are as likely to go to a bishop to get it sorted out.
You had to go to him to get the food supply. That made him enormously wealthy and enormously influential.
Constantine gives Romans a political and financial incentive to convert to Christianity. He gives Christians tax breaks and makes churches tax exempt.
Constantine is the reason why churches are now in the U.S. tax-free entities. Constantine is the reason why churches have this special status.
From the time of Constantine, the church had been the ally of the emperor, and the church became the ally of rulers as rulers became Christian. There was no feeling that there should be a separation between church and state. Church and state worked together.
To honor his newfound faith, Constantine commissioned spectacular building projects in Christ's name throughout the empire. Among the most famous of them, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem.
The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is one of the holiest places in Christendom. The slab on the floor is the place where they say Jesus was originally buried.
But almost as soon as Christians are free from Roman persecution, they begin fighting with each other.
The biggest problem during this time was doctrine. In some people's eyes, Jesus was born of a woman, he can't be divine, and there's big questions about whether is Jesus human, is he divine, is he both?
You would think, wow, this is kind of hair-splitting doctrinal difference here, but there, some people were willing to kill you for that, you see. So Christians willing to kill other Christians for those differences.
To unite the empire, Constantine must gather his bishops under one church, or risk having the Christian empire he's built come crashing down. Under Constantine and the Bishop of Rome, Christianity has gone from an outlawed sect to the ruling force of the Western world.
Constantine was both the head of the state and he was the head of the church. He was still a Roman, and in the old Roman religion, the emperor was also the chief priest. Constantine definitely took that approach to his faith, rather than, what we would now think of as more of a separation of powers.
But despite Christianity's new political advantage, after centuries of being persecuted for not believing in the Roman gods, Christians are now killing each other over disputes in church doctrine.
Constantine needed a way to bind this empire together. He conquered it, but it was crumbling.
He was angry, and he said, look, these things you're quarreling about are just trivial. I stopped the persecutions. You should be grateful. So he called a council to unify the church.
The Council of Nicaea is the first time you bring all of the bishops together and have them start to talk to each other.
The council marks the first meeting of senior church leaders, the foundation of the Pope's College of Cardinals today.
The bishops were commissioned to write what a Christian should believe.
Constantine manages to get the bishops to agree on one singular statement of faith, still used to unify Christians today: the Nicene Creed.
The creed says, we believe in Jesus Christ, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and the council decides that Jesus is fully human and fully divine.
Constantine declared, if you sign it, you're a Christian and you're part of us. And if you don't, you're excommunicated, you're out. You'll probably go to hell. So this became the battling cry for Catholics throughout the world.
With the church unified after Nicaea, Constantine looks to further stabilize the religious foundation of his empire. He establishes a second hub of church power in the East. He names the new capital after himself and calls it Constantinople.
There's a bit of back and forth between Rome and Constantinople.
The Christians in the East tend to look at the Christians in the West as just being barbarians. They would say that the Catholics in the West baptized their children in wolf saliva. The Westerners tend to look at the East as being not strong, effete.
The hierarchy of clergy under bishops who reported to the Bishop of Rome had been working well. But now, with Constantinople acting as a second capital, there is a second bishop who believes that he should be in charge.
There were disputes between the Bishop of Rome, the Bishop of Constantinople. Each one saw himself as a very powerful leader, and each one was competing with the others for authority.
Despite Constantine's best efforts to unify his empire under one church, the East and West remain at odds. 7 years after the Council of Nicaea, Constantine dies, leaving the church still divided and Rome without a strong military leader. For over 100 years following Constantine's death, Rome is under attack from pagan barbarians to the north. After a series of invasions and bloody clashes, the barbarians overthrow the last emperor of Rome. The Eternal City, once home to 2 million people, is reduced to less than 30,000. Once the political and spiritual center of the empire, Rome is now almost abandoned and stays that way for nearly 200 years.
Rome in the 6th century was muddier and messier and perhaps less efficiently governed than it had been in the time of Constantine.
Rome is not a good place to live. It's very dangerous. The standard of living is very low.
Rome was virtually gone. The church's center was in Constantinople.
As Rome falls and Constantinople flourishes, much of the church's terminology becomes Greek instead of Latin. The Bishop of Rome begins to be referred to with the Greek word for father, papus, or pope. During this period of barbarian invasions, there is no centralized government left in Rome. The church is the only institution capable of addressing the needs of its suffering community.
This is a time when the Pope is not just the head of the church, he's also the ruler of Rome.
The people of Rome were enormously dependent on the church as a state. So not as a church that oversaw the relationship between God and man, but as a church that oversaw food, water, safety.
But powerful pagan families looking to control the fallen city see an opportunity. With no official means of protection, the papacy is about to come under direct attack. By 795, pagan barbarian families have been battling for control of Rome for almost 2 centuries. And the papacy is all that stands in their way.
The Lombards are one of the barbarian invaders of the Italian peninsula. They seek to conquer Rome and take over the territory that's being ruled by the papacy.
During an Easter procession, the Lombards viciously attack Pope Leo III.
Their faction wrestles him to the ground and cut off his tongue, but he lives through it.
Pope Leo III realizes that he needs protection, and with no army of his own, he must make an alliance. He chooses the most powerful king in the Western Empire, Charles the Great of France, better known as Charlemagne. On Christmas Day in the year 800, Pope Leo III calls Charlemagne to Rome, where he crowns him Holy Roman Emperor.
Charlemagne took on himself the role of defender of the faith.
The moment that Leo III crowns Charlemagne is really important because what it does, it puts the church back together with the empire. If you have the Pope crowning a king, that means the Pope is giving that earthly king temporal and divine power.
Pope Leo III's decision to crown Charlemagne as Holy Roman Emperor marks the papacy's conscious pivot away from the Eastern Church.
The relations between Rome and Eastern Christians had not been good for a while.
Charlemagne, in his view, he was now the only legitimate Christian emperor left. As he grew in power, developed a very standoffish relationship with the ruler of Constantinople.
And that really is the start of the schism between the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church.
In the 2 centuries after Charlemagne and Pope Leo III unite Western Europe under the papacy in Rome, the eastern part of the empire breaks off and begins to call itself the Greek Orthodox Church under the Patriarch in Constantinople.
The word Catholic originally meant universal. Until the 11th century, there was just the one church. It wasn't until the church at Constantinople broke off from its allegiance to the Pope that we begin to see references to the Roman Catholic Church as no longer meaning universal, but meaning the church which is centered at Rome.
200 years after the historic alliance between Charlemagne and Pope Leo III, Pope Urban II rules the Western Empire from Rome, and the Patriarch reigns over the East from Constantinople, until Constantinople finds itself facing an imminent threat.
Islam is the superpower of medieval period. They're the wealthiest, the most sophisticated. If I was betting at the time, I would have certainly bet that Islam and the Islamic empires were the wave of the future.
Muslim armies have been steadily making their way through the Arabian Peninsula, conquering new lands and uniting them under Islam. They had long since conquered Jerusalem and were headed for the next Christian stronghold.
Muslims had swept through what we would now say is modern Turkey, and really getting fairly close to Constantinople itself.
When you can almost see Muslims across the water, it's time to find the Christians who are left to help you.
Emperor Alexius I of Constantinople writes to Pope Urban II in Rome, pleading for aid against the Muslims.
Alexios is asking a few hundred knights to help him defend his city. What he gets is something entirely different. Urban II is in part responding to an appeal from the Emperor Alexios. As the leader of the church, he's looking to improve the spiritual well-being of his people, but he's also a politician.
Seeing an opportunity to unite Eastern and Western Christians and solidify his place as their leader, Pope Urban II calls an emergency gathering of clergy, knights, and townspeople.
It was probably the most famous speech made during the Middle Ages. Urban told about the plight of Christians in the East who had had their lands conquered, horrible mutilations of nuns and clergy and pilgrims because of their faith. And what Urban did was very clever. Rather than just ask them to go and fight for the East, he also asked them to go all the way to Jerusalem to restore the lands that had been taken by Muslims.
The response is amazing. People shout, "Deus vult, God wills it." And this is the moment that crusading begins across Western Europe.
Pope Urban was an example of a new kind of pope. Austere, powerful personality, the papacy as a self-consciously rallying, purifying, inspiring force, calling on people to do something extraordinary for God. And it had enormous imaginative power.
For the first time, the Pope, a religious leader, once at the mercy of barbarians and dependent upon kings for protection, raises an army and commands a war. In 1094, the Eastern Church calls upon the Pope in the West to help them fight off the incoming Muslim armies. Pope Urban II sees this as an opportunity to reunite Christians and restore the reign of the Roman Catholic Church.
There's a tribal aspect to it, that our tribe is being attacked, just as we still do today. 9/11, someone attacks the United States, people are lined up at induction centers to go off and fight.
When he calls for the First Crusade, Pope Urban II solidifies his role as a world power. The Pope is no longer just a spiritual guide, but a commander at the helm of an army. A zealous fleet of nearly 40,000 starts the long march east towards Jerusalem.
The Crusades were, first and foremost, an act of piety. The Crusades are the only case I know of in human history in which you have thousands of warriors marching thousands of miles deep into enemy territory for no good strategic reason.
The warriors begin their crusade through the Rhineland in what will become modern-day Germany. The destruction in the name of Christ is waged against all non-believers in their path.
One of the terrible things that this group does is that they attack the Jews of the Rhineland. They decide that the Jews are the people who are responsible for the killing of Christ, and that if they are going to act against the enemies of the church, they will do so at home before they do so abroad.
The Rhineland massacres are only the beginning of what will become a century of religious warfare at the command of the Pope.
Once the First Crusade gets into Asia Minor, it's into Muslim-held territory. The Crusaders managed to capture the town of Nicaea, and then they fight a great battle against the Muslims, and they capture Antioch.
Emboldened by their string of unlikely victories, the Crusaders are now convinced beyond all doubt that God is on their side as they prepare to deliver the crown jewel of Christianity back to their Pope, Jerusalem.
Their Lord, Jesus Christ, had had his lands taken, and it was the Crusaders' responsibility, therefore, as his servants, to come to his aid to restore those lands.
The Crusaders were extremely violent. They would attack people in their homes. They were mass rapes, killing of children. They would set fire to entire residential neighborhoods. It was horrible.
They've succeeded in liberating the city of Jerusalem from the hands of the Muslims. And this, for generations, will be hailed and recognized.
After 400 years as a Muslim temple, the Crusaders replaced the crescent atop the sacred Dome of the Rock with a cross and turned it into a church.
Partly motivated by religious zeal, partly motivated by simple desire for conquest. The Crusaders were exclusionary. Muslims were not allowed to live in Christian areas.
Jerusalem remains in Christian hands until 1187, when Saladin, the hero of Islam, draws together the Muslim Near East to recover the Holy Land.
As the Muslims close in on Jerusalem once again, Pope Urban III realizes that in his predecessor's quest to defend Christianity, he may have invited its demise.
The Pope really has to walk a tight wire when he comes through the Holy Land. You have Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Massive faiths basically living on top of each other here.
In 2014, Pope Francis attempts to unify three major religions, in spite of the centuries of holy war that has divided them. Pope Urban II called for violence in the name of one world under one Catholic Church. And Pope Francis is still working to heal the wounds his predecessor inflicted almost 1,000 years earlier.
Religion produces such varied emotions. There is tragedy, there are crimes. It's a story of 2,000 years of such things. And the popes have been part of that story right from the start.
In 1187, after only 88 years under Christian rule, Saladin's Muslim army defeats the Crusaders and reclaims the Holy Land for Islam.
When Saladin recovers Jerusalem in 1187, some of his people suggest they should destroy the Holy Sepulchre. It is Christ's tomb. And he says, no, let's let it survive. Saladin is a man very much aware of the power of mercy.
His rule was very different from that of the Crusaders. Saladin was motivated by his belief that Christians, Jews, and Muslims can and should be able to live peacefully.
As a symbol of a new partnership between Christianity and Islam, Saladin entrusts the key to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to a Muslim family. Even today, it's a Muslim's responsibility to let Christian worshippers in and out of the holiest church in Christendom. Pope Urban III is forced to surrender the notion that Christianity must rule the world and negotiate new relationships with other faiths.
The recognition that it's a Christian space that has to be protected by its Muslim rulers, not in the sense of actually preventing people from coming in, but protecting Christians' rights to worship.
Opening and closing the doors to the holiest Christian site in Jerusalem has been the responsibility of the Al-Husseini men for 8 centuries.
I am the custodian of the Holy Sepulchre Church. We are protecting the church since 1187 until now.
Saladin's gesture has come to symbolize much of what the modern papacy represents. Divine leadership in the face of warring religions.
When I came every morning to opening the church, standing in front of the gate, I see my father and I see my grandfather and I see also Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi waiting to open the church. This is an honor. There is no word to explain how it's amazing.
Today, over 1,000 years after the First Crusade, the Temple Mount area of the old city of Jerusalem is still one of the most contested places on earth. A fragile peace holds, and the site seeks to become a shining example of 3 different belief systems' ability to coexist.
It is the holy place for everyone. You have the Dome of the Rock, and you have the Wailing Wall, and we have the Holy Sepulchre Church. We are looking for peace. We want to live together here like brothers.
Throughout history, the Pope has played an integral role in the ongoing clash of the divide. Thousands of years passed, millions of lives lost. But calls to battle and prayers for peace still endure.
Human beings constantly face the challenge of trying to live in peace and harmony with people different from them. We've seen this throughout history.
The worlds of Urban II and Francis are very different, but their plight remains the same. Both men are tasked with leading the faithful in a world dominated by conflicting beliefs.
The tremendous weight of taking on the shepherding of the great tradition and retranslating it for our time. It's an impossible burden to imagine, but isn't that also the beauty and simplicity of the church?
People look to him because he's a voice of conscience, and it's a voice that has an authenticity to it because it doesn't speak for a political party, it doesn't speak for a national interest. It's a voice of integrity, and he calls us to be the best we can be.
In March of 2000, Pope John Paul II apologizes for the Crusades and the violent campaigns of his predecessors.
We are asking forgiveness for the use of violence in the name of truth, and for the attitudes of indifference and hostility taken towards other religions.
Modern popes choose to follow the example of Saladin and preach coexistence, unlike Pope Urban II, who chose war.
The Pope is where you look towards for an example to how to live your life as a Catholic.
But despite being a religious leader, the Pope's reach extends far beyond spiritual faith.
The Pope survives because it continues to speak to the deepest needs that people have. They need to know that someone is looking out for them. And, all earthly institutions are flawed, but to have an institution which is dedicated to looking out in a fatherly manner for people who are lost and astray and suffering, that need will never go away.
Jesus said to Peter, "You are the rock, and upon this rock I will build my church." A rock doesn't move, it's permanent. So for faithful Catholics, there seems to be a mysterious but yet real depth of appreciation for the stability and permanency of this ideal of the papacy.
Against all odds, in the face of all that has threatened his reign, 2,000 years after the death of St. Peter, the Pope remains at the head of one of the most powerful institutions on earth.
perioada din an când vacanța ta mai vrea o vacanță. Iar discountul e pe măsura gradelor cu minus de afară. 15% reducere la toate zborurile Blue Air. Călătorești mai des, te bucuri mai mult.
Semne bune are anul nou. La Catena cumperi un produs, iar pe al doilea îl primești cadou. În luna ianuarie cumperi un propolis C cu echinacea Forte 30 de comprimate și mai primești unul cadou. Cumperi o vitamina B complex plus vitamina C 30 de tablete și mai primești una cadou. Cumperi un Supradin Energy Q10 30 de comprimate și ghiși C. Mai primești unul cadou. Și asta nu este tot. Întreabă farmacistul și de restul ofertelor 1+1 cadou.
Acestea sunt suplimente alimentare. Citiți cu atenție prospectul.
Iubesc dimineții.